Introductory round, let me just introduce myself while I try to share my screen. I'm Tim Hahn. I'm Heisenberg Professor for Predictive Analytics and Machine Learning at the Faculty of Medicine here. And I hope you can all see my presentation.
Yes,
If you cannot see my presentation, just speak up.
that's
Um,
fine. That's come out and say thanks.
and thanks for having me in this interesting discussion and talk. And I want to talk very, very broadly about artificial intelligence in medicine and the particular things that my group is doing in this area. Just a second. Okay. So let me first briefly start by talking about my own lab, the Medical Machine Learning Lab at the University of Münster. And we basically do three things. The one thing is we create AI software infrastructure, development, optimization, and evaluation, mainly for large-scale research projects. So we have multiple CRCs that are currently running in Germany and Switzerland, where we support a large number of researchers, also in consortia, international consortia, with the development of machine learning software that they can use and to bridge the gap between what researchers need and what we want to do in machine learning and artificial intelligence. One thing that will become apparent pretty quickly is that we don't just need a simple software tool or one machine learning model. But above and beyond the algorithms that we're using, we will need data repositories. We will need a way to gather data, to label data for very many occasions, and also to have a repository to deal with these models, to validate those models, to update those models, and to track them all across their life cycle. So what we will need is not just a machine learning model, but we'll need an artificial intelligence ecosystem if we want to use these things in medicine. And what my group's also doing, which makes sense in this context, is we look at AI quality assurance and certification. So we look at how do these models that we build find their way into clinical practice? How do they generalize? What is their model scope, meaning for which patients can I use them, for which patients can I not use them? What's their bias? What's safety and security, which is a large concern these days that everybody is throwing things into ChatGPT. And also we look extensively into risk profiles, meaning if we want to use this in the clinic, we need to make sure that we understand exactly where these models are not perfect. And finally, the part that I will be talking about today is machine learning research and application. So the things that we do on the science track of things. If you're interested in the things that we do as a lab, there is a QR code at the bottom, or you can just go to mmll.uni-münster.de. So let me jump right in. I think for those people who just introduced themselves, it's all pretty clear. What is artificial intelligence? I still want to break that down a little more. It's basically at the center of statistics, of data science, of computer science, especially if we look at hardware and programming languages and so on, and artificial intelligence, which means everything that we try to abstract but not program. And right in the middle of that lies machine learning, which as a term makes much more sense than artificial intelligence. And what does machine learning do? Machine learning is defined as algorithms that learn from data as opposed to just programming. So if we wanted to program something, then we will have to explicitly know what we want to do. And machine learning gives us the great freedom to provide examples to an algorithm and then train it. But for most people here, that's kind of the obvious thing. So what are typical things that we can do in our that we would like to do using machine learning in our daily practice? First, of course, there is the large topic of biomarker identification. So if we could find biomarkers that help in the diagnosis, of certain disorders or certain diseases, this would be a huge step forward. And this is actually the mainstay of many of the projects of machine learning that we currently do. The second big pillar in this picture is personalized therapy. So we want to be able to predict outcomes. If a patient comes in and is diagnosed, one of the most frequent questions is, what's going to happen next? What's my outcome in 2 weeks, in 2 years, in 20 years? What's my outcome? And how can we optimize interventions in that regard and personalize that to specific people? Um, the third big pillar is patient management. Many of the diseases that we look at in medicine are chronic across the lifespan, which means that we don't just see patients once, but we see patients time and again during their episodes of their chronic disorder. And that also pertains to many of the most expensive disorders, actually. And what we want to do in these cases is, of course, we want to detect them early and we want to prevent them as possible, if possible. That's, of course, the most difficult thing. But also, we want a prediction of outcome and relapse. So if we could know when the next episode starts, we might be able to intervene early and take a lot of suffering away from these patients. And finally, we want to be able not just to have good interventions, but to design interventions from scratch. That's something we're hardly ever doing these days in medicine. But what we actually want is theory-driven intervention designs and model-based optimization of these interventions. So if we could understand the process that generates a disease, then we could intervene based on theory or based on models. And based on models, obviously, that is the machine learning part. Just have to click on this to see something. Um, and the main question that we now have is, how do we get from all the data that we have in ever-increasing quantity and quality these days to these goals that I just outlined? And of course, we need large-scale data sets, multimodal data sets. If we want to train models in medicine these days, we will have to look at big data for many of the applications in machine learning. I will also later get to use cases where there is very little data, but that's obviously not the mainstay of machine learning these days. Also, we want very valid data. We don't just want large amounts of data, but sometimes we need specific interviews, we need specific blood work, we need specific cell type information or something like that. So the phenotypical depth of the data is also, in many cases, much more important than large scale data. So how do we take this step typically? What all of you do, or what's at least done in 90% of all the publications out there, is once we have data, we try group level inference. Group level inference meaning we have a hypothesis and we test that using, for example, a t-test or an ANOVA, where we most of the time simply get where we compare group means. And group means is, of course, a great thing if you don't want to personalize. If you just have a hypothesis about the mean of the population, then group level inference makes perfect sense. It does not make as much sense if you want to make a prediction about a single subject. So whenever you want to know what's happening on average, group level inference is great. Whenever you want to know what's happening to the person that comes through the door next, then group level inference doesn't make a lot of sense. It also doesn't make a lot of sense if diseases are multivariate, meaning there is not one gene, there is not one parameter in the blood work, there is not one single part of an image. But obviously there is a large number of variables, such as in radiology, where we take a large number of images, but the information is never in a single voxel or a single pixel in an image. But obviously, if you look at genetics, it's many SNPs. It's large parts of your image. So in very many cases, we need to look at multivariate data. Also, we need to take into account that what group level inference has brought us was a huge replication crisis because people have focused on the significance of differences in means. So basically, all these group level inference methods work by looking at the difference in means in steps of standard deviation. And that's obviously a thing that's oftentimes, especially if it's just so insignificant, or if the number of samples is very large, is not well replicated. And there's obviously a lot of literature in that, and I could talk for the next hour about that replication crisis. But working in medicine, this is a real problem, and we need to address that replication crisis. And one large step is to understand that what we need in medicine is to formulate the hypotheses that underlie group level inference based on theories. And most of the time, at least in the life sciences and in medicine, that's not happening. So group level inference has a whole host of problems that keeps it from allowing us to make a prediction about a single subject, to make a prediction about inference where lots of variables are needed. So how do we close that gap? And one main way to do this is machine learning. And machine learning has all these advantages that I just pointed out in group level inference are not present. It can make a prediction about a single subject, a single patient, a single event in the patient's life, because this is the very way it's constructed. We train on examples and we make predictions about single examples. So it's well poised to do single subject prediction. Also, in most cases, it's inherently multivariate. We always look at patterns in machine learning, be it in image recognition, be it in computer vision, be it in proteomics analysis. All these methods are inherently multivariate and draw their strength from the multivariate pattern. Also, one of the things that pertain to the replication crisis in particular is that the approach machine learning takes to training and testing models is has a built-in replication and validation scheme. At the very least, any machine learning approach will have a training and a test set. It might have a cross-validation where we draw a number of times the training and a test set. But you will always need a built-in replication because these machines, with a large number of parameters, of course, tend to overfit hugely if you don't do that. So any approach will necessarily have this kind of validation scheme. And that together gives it a potential for direct applications for the questions that we just talked about. So just to make this a little less theoretic, what we basically want to do is we want to move from this cartoon here, where the guy is shoveling snow and the wife is coming out and worries about him having a heart attack. The guy says, will you relax? It's a well-known fact that most heart attacks occur in the morning, and he's shoveling the snow at night. And we all laugh, but we need to realize that that's exactly what group level inference is doing. And what we want to do is we want to move from this to this picture where someone is ringing the doorbell, the wife comes out, and the person at the door says, Henry, it's for you. The wife says, Henry, it's for you. Apparently, your heart is about to fail. So we want to make a prediction about a single subject. And that sums up the first step of what we want to do with artificial intelligence in medicine. And then the very last step is to close the gap to designing interventions and optimizing interventions. And for that, we need to move from predictive models that make a prediction about an unknown quantity to prescriptive models that simulate the processes, the causal processes that underlie this kind of prediction. So machine learning and prescriptive models are highly congruent and well related, but doing causal analysis may be used in different contexts most of the time. But that's very important for everything from designing interventions to building a digital twin to having models that you can actually use to simulate outcomes. That allows us principled way of designing interventions and looking at dynamical systems. Because in essence, all our patients, maybe even all our diseases, are issues in dynamical systems. I will get to that point a little later. And modeling these systems is of course at the highest level of understanding all our diseases and phenomena in medicine, but also obviously the hardest thing to do. So what we want to do in the last step is we want to move from making a prediction about a single subject to having an intervention that requires the least amount of energy to have the largest downstream effect. So we want to treat the patient in the most unobtrusive way possible with the lowest energy possible and still have a very large downstream effect. And one way to look at this is to look at dynamical systems and to take a view of dynamical systems. And what's a dynamical system? It's basically an initial state. In physics, you would argue it's an initial state that evolves over time according to a fixed rule. And that fixed rule, in almost all cases, is a differential equation. And if you look on the right, there is 3 time series that are taken from a very well-known system, where you see they are not random. The first and the second one look quite similar. The third one looks a little different, but it's kind of hard to discern a simple pattern in those. If now you just plotted these things as a system and you would see how these 3 variables move together, then it's quite obvious that this system is quite simple and has a very clear structure. And you would have never seen that if you hadn't switched to a state space view of that system. If you hadn't looked at the 3D data as a complex system, or as a dynamical system, it would have been very, very hard to see that from those time series alone. So that view allows us, if we knew that underlying rule, that differential equation that governs the dynamical system, then we could make a prediction about the future of that system. Then we could simulate that entire system. And that's often done in physics, for example, as you can see on this person who rides a bike, and we look at the flow pattern. Flow patterns are actually among the first or most interesting of these systems that we have in physics. And then finally, we can control systems. And that's one of the most interesting things, to go from making a prediction of a system to simulating a system to then understanding that system enough to control the system. And you can see that this robot is not falling over, and there's a high degree of control over that system and that robot. And that's where we essentially want to go in medicine as well. First, we want to be able to make a prediction. Then we want a digital twin. We want to be able to simulate that system. And then we want to control that system, which in medicine we call interventions. So that's a very important view. So to sum up this first part, what we want to do in machine learning in medicine is reach our goals in medicine, about diagnosis, about personalized therapy, about the management of patients. And lastly, as you've seen in the dynamical systems part, we want to design interventions. What I left out now is the currently probably most important part of what artificial intelligence is currently doing in medicine, and maybe also in all other parts of our lives. It's artificial intelligence as a tool. We don't yet have the biomarkers in all areas. We don't yet have the personalized therapy or the patient management tools. We might have them in a year or in 5 years or in 10 years in some cases, but right now we're using a large number of AI tools every day, such as ChatGPT, such as the Google search. There is a million things on your phone that you can use, which are machine learning tools, basically, and you use them in your life. And that's the same thing in medicine that we're doing. And for the remainder of my talk, I will talk about the AI tools that my group's developing these days and that find their way into medicine as a tool and not as a complete system of clinical support of decision making in the clinic, but simply as a tool. And I would like to get you enthusiastic about these tools because in the end, it will be chaining these tools together um, that that will bring us from bench to bedside and that will bring us into the clinic using artificial intelligence. So, if you look at machine learning tools these days, first thing that you notice is there is already a lot of stuff out there. And if you look at that video, it's taken from a Tesla video these days. The Tesla is driving around, and what you can see on the right is there is a lot happening. The cars are recognized, are segmented, are tracked. There is a huge amount of computer vision that is going on. The first is segmentation, the second one is tracking, and the third one, interestingly, look at the steering wheel, is reinforcement learning. So we don't just want to observe a surrounding. We don't just want to use the computer vision to inform the driver about something, but we want to take actual action in the physical world. And use that car. And these actions are go left, go right, brake, accelerate. These are simple actions. And that's what we also see here. So in this single image, we already have a lot of computer vision models, and we already have a reinforcement learning model that ties them together. And I will just start with something from my group where we can illustrate the first thing that you saw in that video, namely the 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 extraction of information from that image by taking a microscopy image. And what you can see here is this is the quantification of nerve fiber density. And what we want to do is you can see in this image on the left that there's nerve fibers in red. And it's typically quite hard to see those nerve fibers. And what we have done here is we've trained a machine to segment these nerve fibers and to color them in red. And obviously, you can see there's nerve fibers on the right, which is inside the paw of this rat, but also on the outside. And those on the outside are most interesting because the project is basically about what is happening to these nerve fibers after you give a contrast agent. And what we want to quantify is what these contrast agents do to these nerve fibers, because there is a suspicion that in particular gadolinium changes these nerve fibers or might even in the long run destroy these nerve fibers. So one of the huge problems here is there's many nerve fibers in a single cut here. And what they currently do is they do different kinds of staining, and then they by hand manually count these nerve fibers, and then they measure these nerve fibers and get the length and density and these things. Now we used a machine to segment these nerve fibers, and then we can obviously count them automatically. We can look at their length automatically, and that has allowed these studies to move from 4, 5, 6 individuals to 100 individuals or 200 individuals. And that's the first step in a direction where we will get a lot better databases, especially in animal experiments, by using a segmentation based on artificial intelligence. The second example is more of an educational example. Those of you who work in the medical field have probably at some point looked at the colon in a sonography image. And to me, this always looks like dust in a snowstorm. It's extremely hard to differentiate things in the gut, at least to me as a non-expert. And what we did in collaboration with the Department of Gastroenterology is we segmented the colon wall simply to give you a landmark. If you are a beginner, we segment the colon wall in real time while you hold the head of the of the sonography machine, and we segment the colon wall to give you a landmark and help you identify relevant points in the gut. And it turns out that it's a lot easier for beginners to learn it this way. Where do I look? How do I hold the device properly, and so on. And that was one of the interesting things, because that's not easy, because everything's happening in real time. And if you change the position of the head of the sonography machine, um, the whole image changes, the depth changes, the angle changes. So it's a very challenging task for a machine learning algorithm to segment this in real time. And that's what we did in this practice, and that makes it a lot easier for beginners to deal with this. Um, the next computer vision task moves away from simple segmentation a little bit to tracking things. It's also the same thing that you've seen in the Tesla. It all starts with segmenting things. Then the next step is tracking things. And what we have done, I will have to show you images from the internet, because this was with a clinic that made us sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, so that we don't show what they're actually doing. But what we did there is, after surgery, we tracked motions in people. After knee surgery, we tracked how far does your knee bend, how far do your arms go up after surgery, and your shoulder, and can we track that? And as you can see in the videos below, these images, these videos that we call post-tracking, work quite well. So we can identify, without any markers on your body, where are your knees, where are your hips, where are your shoulders, where's your face. And that, of course, allows us to track if you actually have a certain angle while you do a certain exercise, if you can bend your knee to more than 40 degree, to the degree that we want you to. And then we can track that over several days and detect anomalies. And we can't just do that on the whole body. We can also do that, as you can see on that image from Apple, um, on single digits and fingers, or single joints even. And what people did at Apple, by the way, is they made you play an air guitar. So you can actually do it live by moving fingers in the air, and it will play the guitar like you had the guitar in your hand. That's of course a funny application, but you can imagine, if we do that after surgery, then we can track that and find anomalies a lot faster. Um, and that has been a very interesting project, where we can actually identify outliers where something's going wrong a lot earlier. Um, Now, the next example is moving away from computer vision to neural networks. And one thing you need to understand about neural networks is they are basically, from a methodological point of view, they are universal function approximators. And what that means is they can basically learn any function. You can take any image and transform it into any other image. You can take any data and transform it, basically, according to a certain rule, into any other data set. So one thing that you can do is you can take examples from what humans have done and try to train a neural network on those things the humans do. And one thing where this is obviously extremely helpful is in flow cytometry. Flow cytometry involves a manual gating process. So basically, you can take blood or you can take CSF, and then you want to identify the cell types present in that sample. And the way that this works in flow cytometry is that first there is an automatic step that identifies a number of these cell types, but then a human has to go there and manually label these cell types, and that process is called gating. Um, that takes a few minutes for each sample, and together with the Clinic of Neurology, we had more than 15,000 those samples. So it would have taken months or even years to gate all these samples. And what we did is we trained a neural network on several hundred examples where this had been done by human experts. And what we could show is we validated this machine. So it's basically a neural network. It takes in the flow cytometry data and it takes in a number of other markers and tries to identify cell type for each single event. We had a data set with more than 8 million events, so more than 8 million cells in those samples. And, and we had them labeled independently by 4 experts. Then we trained the neural network that does the gating, which we called GateNet, um, on these experts. And we reached a performance that's superhuman because we trained on the consensus of these 4 experts, which is better than each expert alone. So training a network on that, it makes a prediction about the consensus of these people. And that has allowed us to automate gating in these samples with a performance that's better than each single human. And gating for each event only takes 15 microseconds. So it's basically done for one person, it's done in less than a second. And that makes it very, very helpful. And also, it's much more consistent than asking humans because you need to train them. They don't all do the same thing. They don't treat the 100th sample that day the same as the first. Takes a lot of time, and we could really increase the quality of these gating of these processes by quite a bit. And especially in large scale studies, makes perfect sense to use a network like that. Another example of using a neural network and making things faster in a very dramatic way is what we did for the quantification of the normality of the development of the brain. So basically, we all age over time, and the brain changes with that aging. And when a radiologist is looking at your brain and looking if everything is the way it should be, then of course it's relatively straightforward to say, okay, there is a tumor here or there's something missing there. What's much, much harder is saying the density of gray matter or the density of white matter here is not as it should be. That has to do with a huge amount of experience. And this is always debated among the radiologists. So this is quite the difficult tasks. So we took more than 100,000 T1 MRI scans across more than 500 studies, um, and basically build a machine that tells you for your gender and your age. So basically a 32-year-old female tells you exactly what the density of your gray matter, of your white matter, of your CSF in a certain area of your brain should be, and then gives you graphical information of where you are. And if you look at the histogram at the bottom, you can see that this person has way less gray matter than the comparison group that had the same sex and the same age. And then, of course, we can't just do this in the whole brain. We can also do this locally for areas in the brain, and then we color those. And that brain report really, for the first time, gives you the experience that you would have after looking at 100,000 T1 images. And that really tells us what's normal with regard to density of gray matter, white matter, and so on. That has become possible because we were able to pre-process these more than 100,000 images and keep them on a server. And the way this is done, that's where the artificial intelligence and machine learning comes in, because the pre-processing of one of these images currently takes, with standard software, about 20 to 30 minutes, depending on the algorithm. If you wanted to do that for 100,000 scans, this would obviously take a huge amount of time, or you would need a huge amount of compute in some kind of cluster. But certainly you don't want to run this for every single patient. So what we did, and you can see that on the right, is so we trained a neural network to replicate the output that would have come out if we had simply run the standard pre-processing pipeline. And the way that we did this is we actually did run the pre-processing pipeline for 100,000 images on our cluster in Münster. Took 3.5 months on that supercluster. And then we trained a neural network to do the same thing. And what you can see is if now you put in an image, the quality of the pre-processing is the same. There's hardly a way to distinguish whether this is coming out of a neural network or whether this has been pre-processed in the traditional way. Also, it's more than 1,000 times faster. And that means you can do it in less than a second and not in 20 to 30 minutes, which means that while the patient is in the scanner, we can determine these numbers. And based on that, we can, of course, say, okay, now we should look at other things. We could look at different sequences. We could understand that something is not normal in this brain and try to figure it out. And what you can see on the right is what actually happens during pre-processing. And that basically gets rid of the skull. It segments the gray matter, white matter, and CSF, and so on, and then it normalizes that to a standard brain so we can compare. So again, we see that neural networks can hugely accelerate things if you can train them on large amounts of data. And last but not least, I had to do it. Everybody's talking about ChatGPT. Everybody's using ChatGPT. If we were there in person, I would ask who has used it. And most of the time, if you're under 60 and work in our profession, then you definitely have used ChatGPT. So I had to talk about large language models. Large language models are quite interesting. And the way that they generally work, that they're generally trained, is quite simple. So basically, you try to predict the next word. In most cases, you try to predict the next token, but that's a technical differentiation we can discuss later. So let's just pretend what we're trying to do is to predict the next word. And if you have a sentence like, I love eating, then this could be bagels with sour cream, or my mother's meatloaf, or out with friends, which is quite different answers. And you train a model by providing these words step by step and always predicting the next one. And the interesting thing that turned out a few years ago, like 5 years ago, when the first of these transformer models came out, is that if you do that, those models get quite good at this kind of prediction of the next word. And if you now feed in the sentence with a predicted word, then you can make a prediction about the next one and the next one and the next one. And that should give you a hint of what's going to happen if you get really good at predicting the next word. And this would allow you to start a paragraph with half a sentence, and then you could write a whole paragraph or a whole page, or if you want to continue that, a whole book, by predicting the next word and feeding it back in. And this is the way that these transformers are trained. And there's not really a new technology in these GPTs. The fact is that we have scaled them up to such a size with such a large number of parameters that more or less they build an embedding for all these words. They basically they memorize such a large part of the internet in such a dense and compressed, you might say, smart way, that they can generate incredibly good text. And then, of course, there is another step. I don't want to go into detail here, where reinforcement learning is used to fine-tune these models so they produce things that humans like. And that, of course, has been an instrumental step in creating GPTs. But the main idea is really about making a prediction about the next token. So what do we do with that? If we could quantify, we try to find ways, because we happen to be in medicine where it's hugely important that the things that the GPT says are actually true, that they're actually backed by facts and not just a hallucination of these models. So one of the mainstays of our research is to quantify and minimize hallucinations. Three easy, understandable ways to do this is we try to quantify the uncertainty estimates for the distribution of answers. So when you write something into ChatGPT, it generates a single answer. Let's just say a couple of months ago it did generate a single answer, and now it's generating a number of answers and picking a good one. But what we do is we don't generate a single answer, but we generate 20, 40, 100 answers from that probability distribution of answers within ChatGPT or other models. And then we look at the uncertainty of these estimates, because one of the interesting things is that answers that are not factually correct, that are in fact wrong, have a much higher entropy in the uncertain. So they have a much higher uncertainty, a much flatter distribution of uncertainty values, which tells you that this was actually a difficult problem. And then we analyze these distributions of uncertainties across those answers. And that turns out to be a very simple, but a very good way of finding out if there is an hallucination. The second way that we approach this is by quantifying the similarity between the answer and the context. So in medicine, we don't ask very general questions that should be a part of GPT. We ask very specific questions. We ask specific questions that you will only find in some specific guideline or in some specific patient information or manual about something. And so we can basically check whether the answer that we're given is present in those documents that we provided to the GPT model. And we can check back. Of course, you could do this yourself. You could basically check, okay, it says on page 8, there is this information, and is that actually interpreted in the right way? And we simply use a second large language model to do just that. A second large language model that checks if the answer makes sense in the context of that text. It's also quite simple, but it works. And the third one is a little more for research topic. If you could transform the information that you have in a text into a graph, basically showing the relation between entities in the text, think of it as if I put Harry Potter in it, the book, and we could draw a graph for the relations of all the characters in the book, then we would end up with a graph that has characters and arrows that connect them by certain links, like likes, hates, wants to kill, whatever. If you can transform your text into that kind of knowledge graph, then you get a whole host of new tools where you can use tools from computer science that have been around since the late 70s that deal with the verification of graphs. And you can check logic and consistency in these graphs. So if you can turn it into a proper graph, then you get a new toolbox of verification tools. And of course, we have a few more ways of dealing with that. And that's actually a very hot research topic these days, because if we could minimize the number of hallucinations or the severity of hallucinations, this would open up whole new use cases, such as the current projects that we're looking at. We are currently building expert systems for medical guidelines. So basically, for many of the diseases, we have medical guidelines. It's just that the number of experts who know these 100 to 300 pages, is very limited. There is only a few experts who actually know them by heart, and most of the time it's the same people who authored them. But if you go to your GP, there is no way that he or she could ever know all these guidelines of all the diseases that they see every day. So we talk to the societies that wrote these guidelines and build expert systems that give you information. Then you can basically say, okay, I know this patient has disease X, and I have an expert here for disease X that will answer only from these guidelines. It knows everything that's in the guideline, but nothing that's not in the guideline. Whenever you ask it about anything else that's not in the guideline, it will simply say, I don't know. It's not in the guideline. And that's actually a hugely important characteristic of a model, to be able to say, I don't know. because that's something that ChatGPT will never do. It will always give you an answer. And that's very, very dangerous, especially if the uncertainty is high. So we build expert systems based on medical guidelines. Second project is we want to build assistants that help us document things in the clinic. And Christian knows this. We want to look into surgery protocols. We want to look into discharge letters. There is just a huge amount of documentation that you have to do in your daily practice that we could largely automatize. If we had access to the patient file, then we could at least pre-scribe this. We could write it out and have you check it after that. And at least for surgery protocols, that's relatively straightforward. And right now we're working on discharge letters and want to roll this out in the clinic. And just today we had a meeting about that, and it's progressing nicely. Also, a very important thing is pharmaceutical expert systems. We have more than 70,000 compounds in our in-house pharmacy. And so we built 70,000 bots, one for each information of this compound. There's always a patient information and there is always a physician information. So we built an expert for that particular compound. And now you can ask these expert systems, can I combine it with this? Can I take it with milk? Can I do this and this and this? It seems trivial, but if you look at the things patients want to do, it's most of the time I have questions about medication. I don't speak proper German. I'd much rather have this in simple language or in Arabic or whatever. So having this information ready, basically in any of the large languages, and also being able to interact with the patient, where the patient can say, I didn't understand that. What does that mean? Explain that again. Explain that to me like I'm 5 years old, is actually a lot more helpful than I initially thought. Yeah, and then there is currently like 5 to 7 other projects that I don't want to get into that all deal with something like that. And it's always the same thing. We need to build specific expert systems, not use ChatGPT with general knowledge, but build specific expert systems where we can rely on the fact that they're pretty dumb about everything in the world, except for the one thing that they're experts in. And for that, we want to guarantee that they give you the right answer. And if we can solve that, there's a huge number of use cases for that kind of thing. And finally, transformer models, such as GPT. GPT is generalized pre-trained transformer. Transformer models are just architecture of neural network. You cannot just use them to look at language. You can use them to look at any sequence that you can think of. And one sequence that we're very interested in is the sequence of measurements in an ICU. People are in an ICU for several hours to several days, sometimes weeks, but that's fairly rare, obviously. So if we could build a transformer model to which we can feed the time series of all the measurements that we can make in an ICU, like blood pressure, pulse, like blood work. And I mean, you can already see the sampling rate of these things is hugely different. Blood work is done once a day. Pulse is measured continuously. We can look at urine output and so on and so on. So one of the great things about the transformer is that you can give it any sequence. A sentence, in essence, if you think about it, is also just a sequence of words, but sequence matters. If you change the sequence of words, the meaning gets lost. So we put in not sentences, but time series, multivariate time series. And we build a transformer. Transformers are notorious for being extremely good, but needing a huge amount of data. So we have intensive care patient data from ICUs with everything from pulse rate to blood pressure to urine output for more than 500,000 patients. 100,000 of them come from our in-house ICU in Münster. And what we want to do, and that's an ongoing project, is to build a transformer model, just like the one that you see on the bottom, which, this is a little bit of irony, was generated by a transformer, by an image transformer. where I just said, please provide me with the architecture of a transformer model, which is kind of funny. We want to train this model, and since it's a generative model, we can simulate any effects that the things that we do to the patient might have on these parameters that we have previously measured. So if we want to do something, then we can actually check whether the model thinks that this will have an effect on urine output or pulse rate, whatever. So what we would get in the end, if that works out, is an in silico simulation of all the interventions that we could do. And in this case, we focus on the kidney. So we want to do interventions that are protective for, it should be protective to the kidney. So just so you keep in mind, the transformer models are not just for text or speech. Transformer models are also great for multivariate time series if you have a lot of data. If you don't have a lot of data, then LSTMs are still superior, but with a lot of data, transformers are just amazingly good. And that's the figure that I showed you in the beginning. We have talked about algorithms a lot, the tile in the middle. But also, of course, if you want to bring this into clinical practice, you will need data. You will need to integrate this system into your clinical practice and routines. You will have to have a repository of models to share this with other clinics everywhere in the world. So we don't all have to train our own models. Then we need to be very rigorous about evaluation, about certification, about the performance of these models to really make sure that they work. Because one of the critical things about these models is that it's more or less impossible to understand how they do things. It's not that they're black boxes. They're certainly not black boxes. You can look into them and you can look at every single step that they do. It's just that it's so many steps that no human could ever comprehend that. So they are practically not black boxes, but functionally, for any human, they are. And luckily in medicine, we have a very good way of dealing with that. We don't have to exclude these algorithms. We simply do clinical studies and RCTs with these models where we simply check whether they work and whether they are safe. And one of the great things about an RCT is you don't need to understand the mechanism of action. You don't need to understand the way that these models work to check if they're effective, efficient, and safe. And that's one of the great things. That's not quite understood in politics these days, but in medicine, we've known for more than 100 years that you do not need to understand the mechanism of action to test the effectiveness and the efficacy and safety of a drug. And we can do exactly the same thing for artificial intelligence algorithms. And then we need to bring them into the clinic. And with that, I'd like to thank you. This is only part of the team, and I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, for this great presentation. Yeah, any questions from the audience? Nobody?
Uh, Okay, then I start, Andreas.
Yeah.
So I can also switch on my video again. I think the research is one topic, and everything sounds very interesting and straightforward, more or less. Have you already, for some of those models, crossed the gap of that you can practically, or that they kind of pass the test, pass the trials, so that you like you relieve drugs to the public, right? Is there, at least for some of those projects, did you already reach that level?
The gate net I showed you, that is actually in use. So this is pretty easy because this is a process in the lab that we could verify. So that's relatively straightforward. Whenever you want to use stuff on patients, it's of course a lot harder because it might be a medical product in the end, and you need to figure that out. And for the large language models, we're currently on the path of certifying that. But again, the large language models have been around for, well, in practice for 2 to 3 years now. And that means that in the beginning, we had to figure out a way to do that. And now we're in the phase of certifying them. So except for the GateNet, it's all research. But I'm very happy that after 15 years of machine learning research in my life, I'm finally seeing a translation into clinical practice. So I'm extremely happy and I'm very excited to now see the things that we've worked on for more than a decade to see them translated into the clinic. So that's just starting. So to answer your question, it's very little right now, but it will be, I would argue, in 2 years, lots of processes in any clinic, be it administration or be it patient care, will be very different. And most of that is based on transformers and large language models, and maybe computer visions in a second place.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions to Tim?
Thank you for your nice talk. I was wondering, how are you dealing with data protection, especially if you have patient data? Yeah, how are you doing this?
Yeah, that's obviously a very important question in practice. I live in two worlds when it comes to data protection. One is my happy little research world in which we conduct studies, get ethical votes, get GDPR approvals, and then we run those studies. That's all pretty straightforward and easy. And all the studies I showed you are done as research studies and are thus pretty easy to handle because we will have a concept about anonymizing them or pseudonymizing them or whatever. So in my research world, that's kind of a nuisance because it takes a lot of time and sometimes it's a lot of paperwork, but it always works in the end. In clinical practice, it's a lot harder because in clinical practice, you need to deal with actual patient data, and you need to do it in an environment that is protected. So the solution that we're currently planning is to do all the things that I showed you, especially with regard to large language models on premise. So to have hardware that is dedicated to use in the clinic, that's part of the intranet of the clinic, and to keep everything inside. That has, of course, the one big disadvantage that you need to host the hardware, and whenever it becomes old, it becomes too small, it becomes too expensive, you can't do it anymore. So yeah, data protection is a huge issue. Not so much in research, but a lot more in clinical practice. And I think at some point we need to ask the political question, not of how many people actually die because of data protection. And that's a question we ask way too seldomly, because that's something that is actually happening every day in Germany. People are dying because of too restrictive data protection. And now that AI is coming in, it will be even more so. The patients who can provide information, the patients that provide information that we can train on, will, in the long run at least, get better patient care. And right now, in the minds of patients, giving data away is always a risk. At some point, people will realize, not now because these algorithms are not out there, but in 3 years, in 5 years, people will realize that their treatments will strongly improve if they provide certain data. And then they will want to do that. And I think in the end, the only solution that will cover everything is giving patients the power to have their own to have all the rights with their own data. It's not that we host it, but that the patient hosts it. That the patient can press a button and say, I will give it to this purpose, to this model, to this research, to this physician. And then also take it back at the press of a button. And then we can finally not just have agreements where we collect lots of data and talk to patients all the time, but patients decide from case to case, is this an instant that I want to share certain data, or is this a case where I don't want to share data? And then, as always, the people who are most sick, they will share everything. It's already the same in research these days. And the patients that are not as sick, they will think twice about sharing data. And that's a pattern that we've seen for many years. So to sum this up, in research, it's tedious, but it's straightforward and it mostly works. In clinical practice, it's these days very hard. And in the end, the only way of dealing with that is giving patient power about their individual data.
Thank you for the explanation.
Okay, yeah, I really like that idea that you're responsible for your own data. And I think we talk a lot about data privacy, but we forget the consequences. So that it's maybe the security for the data is not always the security for the patient's health. Okay, anyone who has another question for Tim?
Yes, thank you for your excellent presentation. You have outstanding results in my perspective of view. But data changes over time, right? We get new MRIs, new ways of recording electronic health records. So we might face the fact to have to retrain the models we developed over time to keep them as accurate as possible. And maybe you could argue a little bit in that direction and what that means for the medical device regulation certifications when you're applying it now to the large language models. How long will it hold until we have to go for certification?
Yeah, of course, it's very important to look at these models over their entire life cycle. Starts with planning the collection of the data, actually, before you even start in the collection. That's something that I often deal with, that by the time people contact me, they already have a lot of data, or they already have a CRC running or have some study running. And it would be ideal if they did this in the planning phase of their study. But as we all know, people get data, then they don't know what to do with it. And then at some point, they find a machine learning guy who looks at the data. So this would actually be the beginning of the life cycle that I would like to enter. Most of the time, that's not happening. Then it's training the data. We need to talk about federated learning more. We need to talk about data sharing. We need to talk about what does it mean if I generate data using text money? Who can access this data? Because right now, it's most of the time it's consortia or single researchers who benefit from not sharing the data in the sense that they will be a co-author on like 150 papers in the future. People don't talk about this a lot, but there is a lot more data out there than is publicly available. And I know that that at least the DFG, the German Research Foundation, has made great strides in the past 10 years to move from do with the data whatever you want to at least forcing researchers to talk about it, to say, what's my plan? What could I do? This is a huge step forward, and we need the same for every bit of clinical data. Then next step in the life cycles is models. If I had any say in that, I would make every model publicly available, because in my view, this is the only way to validate them properly. Why would I care if my model works on my single scanner in my single clinic, whatever, with my collective of patients? Needs to work we need to look at model scope. Of course, we could have a definition for it only needs to work in this population, then it's totally fine. It's perfectly fine. But there needs to be a definition of model scope. And that's what's often not happening, and then they fail in practice. Even though they work quite well in research studies. We had that once. We trained a brain age model, was excellent, and then people applied it in China. And we didn't have a single Chinese sample. We had more than 100,000 participants, but we didn't have a single Chinese person. The model was extremely bad in all the Chinese people. And then in the end, we shared that model with them, and then they tweaked the model with their data, and then it works out fine. But sometimes we're quite blind to these things. And especially if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, I have more data on my laptop, MRIs, scans on my laptop than we have in total from people who live in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's just a very bad situation. And then finally, to get to your point, of course, once the model has been deployed, we need to track the stats of these models, because obviously they all have trouble in prediction out of sample. And of course, there may or may not be in many cases, there will be a distribution shift over time. There is two answers. One is, once we move into the direction of understanding causal mechanisms in these models, and causal machine learning is one huge topic, we don't need to worry about this as much, because if we identify a causal mechanism and we have a proper measure of a variable that is a causal variable in the system, then obviously there will be no distribution shift unless that mechanism changes. And that only happens over evolutionary time spans, so don't worry about it. We're quite a way away from causal machine learning at scale, so it's still a problem. Now, of course, we need to observe these shifts. Now there is one technical answer and one content-wise answer, basically. The thing that we need to understand is that we could continuously retrain our models so that a distribution shift would never occur, because we could basically train a model every day or every month or every week. The one thing that keeps us from doing that, or there is two things that keep us from doing that. One is that training a model could be so expensive, or keeping the data could be so expensive that we don't want to do that. In case of large language models, if we wanted to retrain a large language model, costs like even if you look at the cheaper ones, several million euros every time. And that's not going to get better anytime soon. Data centers are getting larger, costs are exploding. So if the model is small enough, we could retrain it every day. And everything that I've shown you in my presentation, I could retrain at least every month, because the computational cost is comparatively so low that I could do this every month. For some things, even twice a day, it doesn't matter. The second problem is in certification, because that system doesn't know this idea of continuous retraining. They certify a model. They, of course, obviously, they want information about the training set. They want to know about bias. They want to know about efficacy. They want to know about accuracy and performance measures. It's all a legitimate claim. They are perfectly right. But we need to think about a way to deal with these things, to generate trust in real time. And I think that some very interesting things come from a partner that we work with in Harvard, who use who basically try to find a way to trust these systems while we continuously retrain them. And then they generate tokens on the blockchain, and then they have certain tests that they run against this model. And then they certify that these tests have actually run. But that's not my area of research. There's much more qualified people out there. But there needs to be some real-time or almost real-time technical way of dealing with this type of certification, because otherwise we will always be behind on these models. And I cannot imagine that someone who comes in and has a certain type of cancer will be happy if the oncologist says, Yeah, actually, there is a very good model in Harvard. It came out 3 months ago, and that's an excellent model, and that would probably be much better in your case, but we can't use it because it's not been certified. Um, and they retrain it every day. So the pressure on politics is going to get fairly high, but it's only in the last 2 months that politicians in the European Union have rethought whether they might be over-regulating things. For the past 15 years, it's always been more regulation, more regulation. It's only in the last three months, basically, that this slowly started that they at least realized that something's fundamentally wrong with this.
Yeah, thanks for pointing out this challenge. I would agree to your view, but maybe not the last one, because right now we have as well the AI Act, which is covering the topic more or less, and it might increase the challenge to medical AI machine learning use. Yeah, and there are some new open questions in that regard, right? So it remains a challenge, and yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Yeah.
I think that the AI Act in and of itself is, first of all, a good thing because they try to streamline all the negotiations and all the things that they do in AI and regulation in one piece of legislation. That's a good thing. The bad thing is that at some point we will need to translate this into national laws and legislation. And again, my fear is that the 27 member states will do this in at least 32 ways. And my experience, especially with GDPR, is that GDPR should be a great harmonization across countries, when in fact the GDPR has made it a lot easier to collaborate with colleagues in Spain. When a collaboration with colleagues in Aachen, they interpret the GDPR differently, and they could not be part of a European project with 8 countries in total, where all these countries agree. Just our second location in Germany didn't agree with the interpretation of the GDPR. And that just needs to stop. Can't be that everybody in Italy is happy, but we can't do it next door. That's just not acceptable.
Especially since the AI Act is lacking so many details by intention, but
Yeah.
thereby it opens the door again for all these challenges. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. I think the only way of dealing with this in the end is to have great use cases and make them so visible and so valuable to patients that the general public basically pushes politics to accept these changes. This is the only way it's going to go. If patients say, I want this, and if I went to the Netherlands, it would be possible. Why is it not possible here? Then they will act, and not before that. If you want to lobby them, try that for 10 years.
Yeah, it's just need the public protest. It needs the public pressure. So why is the healthcare? Why can I get better healthcare in Netherlands than I can get it here? So this is a question that a politician should have to answer. And if it's because of regulation, then you should change the regulation and allow stuff that's allowed somewhere else. But I'm afraid it takes a couple of years, especially since healthcare does not seem to be much of a priority in the current government, I'm afraid. Let's see. Okay, anybody who has another question for Tim? Otherwise, looking at the time, I would like to thank you very much, Tim. And the presentation will be recorded, and so you can have a look at it again. And yeah, so I'm looking forward to see you all next week. So let me see. So Sebastian, no, sorry, not Sebastian. We have another great speaker again on AI and bioinformatics. And this will be presented by Dominik Haider. So yeah, hope to see you all again next week. And yeah, have a good evening. And thanks again, Tim, for a great presentation. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having me. Bye.